But to go back to the earliest part of history, because I know you know a lot about this stuff, and it's so fascinating to me. That there's two things that happen in the 1940s that really just like set the bar for this space. The first thing is the aforementioned Manhattan Project that you brought up, where we build the nuke or whatever.
Yeah.
The second thing, which is supposedly separate but then ends up kind of being related, is Roswell, which happens out west as well. Yeah. Allegedly, these aliens landed there, whatever, and then there was this cover-up. But like with the Manhattan Project, I've heard you talk about this before on some of your podcast episodes. What was the depth of the discussion that like Oppenheimer had around UFOs while he was out there working on this project? And were there things that were potentially seen, or what was going on there?
We don't know, but there's a book called UFO Secrecy in the Fall of Robert J. Oppenheimer by a guy named Donald Burleson. He's an Air Force guy. And there are some weird things around that kangaroo court that was held where he lost his Q clearance, where like the premise of the book is that it wasn't around him socializing with, possible communist spies or whatever in the 30s, and that actually it could have been around some of this UFO stuff. And a lot of the quotes like from the kangaroo court is he's saying between 45 and 49 a lot happened, and he keeps saying that. It's like this recurring thing. And if you actually think about like the bomb itself, it was 41 through 45, and all the crash, all the lore around UFO crashes 45 through 49.
Yes.
So maybe there's something interesting there. John von Neumann, who's defending him in one of these kangaroo courts, is saying, it took him a while to get adjusted to the Buck Rogers universe that we're living in. He might have been referring to just nuclear weapons. I mean, that's like a weird universe. But Buck Rogers is this comic strip at the time, and it's all about like space travel and time travel. And then Gordon Gray is this North Carolina lawyer who was rumored to be on the Majestic 12, who, Truman and Eisenhower's sort of counsel around UFOs. And he was an actual guy. He was overseeing, this kangaroo court with Oppenheimer. And so there's some interesting possible data points there. And then I'm trying to think of other like Condon, who's, the guy who writes the protocols for atomic secrecy, which gets overlaid onto UFO secrecy. He writes the McMahon Act around atomic secrecy, which is 1946. A lot of that language gets used in the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, which creates the Atomic Energy Commission and the DOE. And so you have this guy he's a close confidant of Oppenheimer, this guy, Edward Condon. He wrote the first English language textbook on quantum mechanics. He studied with Oppenheimer at Göttingen in Germany in the 30s. He grew up in Alamogordo, right next to Los Alamos, and helps pick Los Alamos as a spot for the Manhattan Project. He wrote the Los Alamos Primer, which every single employee had to read upon joining Los Alamos. And then 6 weeks into the Manhattan Project, he clashes with General Leslie Groves, Matt Damon's character in Oppenheimer, around UFO secrecy. And then he goes on to write the UFO secrecy protocols. And then his Q clearance is also stripped around 53, 54. So it's this weird connection. And then 66, he forms the Condon Commission. He's given his clearance back in this really dubious, weird way. We can get into the details around that.
Yeah, please.
And then, okay. So he's given his Q clearance back by a guy named Lou Branscombe, who's on the Jason Advisory Committee. Jasons are like this very hardcore group when it comes to, overall, like very high level, U.S. defense strategy. And Lou Branscombe is this understudy from his Harvard days from Don Menzel. And Don Menzel is also rumored to be on the Majestic 12. Again, I don't know if he was, but he's this top astronomer who is this professional UFO debunker. For some reason, it like feels like it's this guy's job to be like a UFO debunker. So you have his like direct understudy like giving Condon his clearance back, and then I think that was like used as like bait to like get Condon basically to like do their bidding and basically say like you have to like squash this subject. And the reason I think that is because in the background there's this Washington FBI field agent named Guy Hoddle, who's basically building a ton of compromise on Condon himself. And if you actually look at the Hoddle memo on the FBI website, It's the #1 document on the FBI website. It's literally the most read document on the FBI website. It's a memo that is written to Hoddle by, an Air Force guy saying that, he's found a UFO that's crashed with, its whole crew intact or whatever. So we know that Hoddle was at least knowledgeable of the UFO phenomena at the very least, like at a high level. And he's building this kind of dossier on Condon. And then Condon gets his clearance back under very mysterious circumstances. And even in an American Institute of Physics interview that he gives, Condon, the interviewer is like, were you given your clearance back because of specific UFO cases that you had to review as part of the Condon Commission? And he gets all weird about it. And like he's like repeats himself like a million times, like maybe I saw like a movie or two or something, but like, no, I didn't need my clearance back. And like, it sounds like he's kind of covering for something. And so you have this weird connection between him and Oppenheimer. And then the final thing I'll say, and I don't know what this means, but it's like, I think sometimes if you're like creating this big atomic blast, I think in some ways, you're creating like a big force. You're getting closer and closer to like levels of ontological truth. Like my guess would be like the Manhattan Project. Maybe you figure something out, and then like CERN. Like maybe you figure something like maybe it's more than like the Higgs field or something that you figure out with like the Large Hadron Collider. And so like maybe
all together.
Maybe you get deeper into ontological truth. Like in this case, in CERN's case, it's electric plasma thrusters. And in the Manhattan Project's case, it's like, it's a uncontrolled nuclear fusion or whatever. And so I mean, I don't know, but
what was the name of that book again? About
it's called UFO Secrecy. It's UFO Secrecy in the Fall of Robert J. Oppenheimer. Yeah.
So he's putting together through a lot of secondary sources, meaning like not Oppenheimer himself, but other people around the situation and evidence we can collect to circumstantially say, if this, then that, if this, then that, if this, then that, then that, then that, then that. Because why are all these different people in the orbit acting in this way to get rid of this guy in particularly who may know this thing about UFOs? Yeah. So it's circumstantial, but he builds up like a lot of bricks in the house, so to speak.
Yeah, it's completely circumstantial. There's no smoking gun, but he builds up a lot. By the way, I said I think fusion. I meant fission. But
you're forgiven.
Thank you. Got to get it right. Yeah. I know your audience, Julian. They keep me accountable. But it's not. There's no smoking gun. It's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but it's interesting. I think it's worthy of follow-up and further investigation. There's also a 1971 Australian document written by their Joint Intelligence Organization, the head of their nuclear division, a guy named Harry Turner. And it's really interesting. There are a lot of these like UFO detonation experiments being done actually in Australia. And Harry Turner is overseeing this, presumably.
UFO detonation?
Sorry, UFO atomic detonation experiment. They're UFO detonation experiments. Yeah, you're not familiar with that? Get on it, Julian.
Yeah, let's get a video up.
Yeah, let's do it. AI like Sora or something. No, they're blowing up bombs there. And you think about Australia, and it's good. There's a lot of desert. A lot of desert. Yeah, exactly. And so he starts to think, maybe there's more to this UFO story. That I think they had some UFO sightings around their nuclear stuff. And by the way, the other thing that makes sense about Oppenheimer being read in is UFOs are crashing and showing up around. At least we know they're showing up because of UFOs and nukes, but maybe crashing around these sites. And so, it would make sense that like somebody like an Oppenheimer would be read in. And so Harry Turner's the Australian Oppenheimer or whatever, like he starts to get interested in this, and he starts to think that maybe the U.S. and their inquiries into UFOs and anti-gravity are way more than meets the eye. This whole Blue Book thing is like, he's like, maybe this is just an op. And because Blue Book is like the front-facing program that the Air Force has to, again, explain away everything, downplay everything. And we know this because of, H.P. Robertson, this Caltech physicist, writes this memo in 1952, which was supposed to be, it's been declassified since, but it was supposed to be classified at the time. And it was basically saying like Blue Book your mandate is to minimize this stuff,
Right.
explain it away. It's swamp gas. It's, weird lights, whatever.
Balloons.
Weather balloons, and, minimize this stuff through media, through narrative and storytelling. Like it's very clear about what the goal is. And so Harry Turner in Australia is saying, maybe there's actually more to this. And he does this investigation. And I think this was probably right around when the Five Eyes are being formed as well, where like there's more intelligence sharing between, allied, Australia, UK,
right.
US, Canada, that sort of thing. And man, this document is crazy. You can actually look it up. It's on John Greenwald's like Black Vault or whatever, he has all these like, old declassified documents. And it is a comprehensive document that shows that the U.S. had these like anti-gravity outposts. They were studying gravity systematically. The CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence was studying this stuff. And you had this guy, Agnew Bonson, who's, UNC, the Institute of Field Physics, the UNC Chapel Hill. Bryce DeWitt is working with him. Then you have the Gravity Research Foundation at MIT. You have University of Indiana. You have Purdue. You have MIT. You have Princeton, and you have the Institute for Advanced Study, which I believe those two were different at the time, even though the Institute for Advanced Study was...
What year are we in right now, roughly?
We're in... So he's writing this document in 1971, but all of those institutions, the academic institutions had been set up prior to this, but this is all like mid-century. Like 50s, like anti-gravity was super in vogue. People were really deep into gravity research. So much so that Lewis Witten, who's Ed Witten, the greatest string theorist of all time, Lewis Witten is working at Martin Corporation, which is pre-Lockheed Martin. He's working in their anti-gravity division called RIAS, Research Institute for Advanced Study, which is a play on IAS, Institute for Advanced Study. And he says, we are going to figure out gravity in about the time that, it took to build the first atom bomb. And you have Stanley Desser and Richard Arnowit working on these gravity particle theory, gravitons. And, so anyway, Lewis Witten says gravity is in the wind, meaning it is everywhere. But maybe there's a sub reading to that, which is in the wind is actually an intel spy term, which means it's scattered everywhere. Yeah. So like maybe like it's in the wind in that it's like compartmentalized in all these different places, and there's some top of the pyramid view on like where that gravity research is headed. Who knows? It gets vaporized like in the early 60s, but it was extremely vital at the time. And so he meant, I think when he said in the wind, it was like, it was ubiquitous. It was like very in vogue. And you have all these, Ansel Talbert, I believe, was this Air Force guy who wrote a lot about it. You have this Michael Gladich article called Here Come the G Engines. And all of these patrons of aerospace are exuding supreme confidence that beating gravity is around the bend. And this ties in with the Chapel Hill Conference where quantum gravity gets created in 1957, which was under Agnew Bonson at the Institute of Field Physics at UNC Chapel Hill, which you can see in this document is one of these outposts studying gravity. And they're also simultaneously funding Townsend Brown, who has his capacitor gravity experiments. And so anyways, all of this is to say Oppenheimer is listed as one of the scientists deeply involved in anti-gravity research. Oppenheimer, Teller, Wheeler, and Freeman Dyson are all mentioned as being, really important to this story in that Australian document. And so, yeah, just to comprehensively answer your question about whether Oppenheimer was involved, I don't know.
Oh, you answered it. That's a lot. Essentially, it could be, and we're speculating here, situation where for whatever reason in this research that could tie all the way to UFOs when we're talking about anti-gravity, Oppenheimer may have either and or known too much or perhaps formulated an opinion behind the scenes that they didn't like.
That could totally be true. Yeah, he would. There's a book called UFO Crash by this UFO researcher William Steinman. And there supposedly was a crash right after Roswell in Aztec, New Mexico, in 1948. And Oppenheimer was rumored to be part of the collection crew.
Collection crew?
Yeah, like the crash retrieval guy. One of them.
I need Cillian Murphy at the site right now. I need that.
Yeah, but, I don't know. It's unclear why they would have gone after him. He was obviously like extremely idealistic in some ways.
Yes.
He obviously regretted aspects of the body. I've become
death.
I've become death, destroyer of worlds. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know where he went astray or what happened or whether he was even involved in the UFO thing. This is all predicated on, there being some core program that
Sure.
he was involved in. So you have to think probabilistically. Again, there's a world in which maybe he wasn't, but.
And it would tie directly into the lore, though, because it involves literally the godfather of nukes.
Well, that's the thing. If you want real disclosure, you have to look into the historical stuff.
Yes.
Like the theorizing, the crazy time travel shit. That's so interesting. I love it. But it's as Feynman would say, not even wrong, completely unfalsifiable. You can run in circles, talking about this stuff. And then, the other vector is we are waiting on the government for disclosure. Just please give us the information. We'll be fine. We're not going to be freaked out or whatever. And then there's real historical research where it's this stuff wasn't that long ago. We're talking 70 years ago, 75 years ago, whatever. Were these people at all entangled with the UFO story? We just made a $130 million movie about Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
He's the godfather of American science. We should maybe just look into that. What did he know?
Yeah.
So I set out investigating UFOs, and one of the first things I did 8 years ago was read Nick Cook's excellent book, which I all commend to you, The Hunt for Zero Point, which frankly is the definitive beginning for me on the search and the explanation for what really lies behind this mystery. He's a respected aerospace journalist, Nick, and he began similar investigations to mine about a quarter of a century ago, with the premise that around 1956, a group of scientists and a group of aerospace engineers had started talking very openly in the popular press about anti-gravity, propulsion, and how it would soon become a reality. The G engines are coming, we were told. And those articles referenced the Glenn L. Martin Aircraft Corporation, Bell Aircraft, Lear Aircraft, and, as Nick wrote, several other American aircraft manufacturers who would not spend millions of dollars, as they were, on researching science fiction. There was also mention of an elusive George S. Trimble, who was the head of advanced programs and vice president in charge of the G project at Lockheed Martin, which was at the time Martin Aircraft, but it later became Lockheed Martin. Back then, Trimble led Martin Aircraft's RIAS, the Research Institute for Advanced Studies, the predecessor to what became Skunk Works. And it was also clear Trimble had a background in highly classified advanced physics concepts. And Nick, to his enormous credit, pieced together that Trimble had put together a team in 1957 researching anti-gravity. And yet 2 years later, all these stories started appearing in the popular press where Trimble was making the extraordinary claim that the conquest of gravity, quote, could be done in about the time it took to build the first atom bomb. Now, there were also fascinating early references around this time in academic journals to electrogravitics research, tantalising suggestions from excited scientists that developments were underway in secret that had profound implications for the human race. Respectable scientific journals were referencing the work of Thomas Townsend Brown, claiming that in experiments which had been peer-reviewed, he'd achieved anti-gravitic effects cutting weights by as much as 30%. And one very interesting aspect of T.T. Brown's work was that when he'd arrived at the best shape for an anti-gravitic craft, intriguingly, it was disc-shaped. Yet that supposed scientific breakthrough didn't happen. It's never happened. And if you allow 5 years or so for an equivalent program to the atomic program, it should have happened in the early 1960s. And so Nick's book had left us with the tantalising probability that there'd been sometime in the mid-50s a breakthrough in anti-gravity propulsion that was quickly suppressed by the military or by the government. For a very brief moment, scientists had talked openly about it and freely about the dawn of a new age, huge implications for mankind. And then, bang, the door closed. and everybody shut up about it.
Do you think another country like China or Russia is responsible for it?
That's a really interesting question that never gets asked. And okay, you want to go to a really trippy place? So Agnew Bainson, who creates the Institute of Field Physics in the 50s with Bryce DeWitt, the whole purpose of this thing is to study gravity. And, you know, the Chapel Hill Conference in 57, you have Freeman Dyson and John Wheeler and all these, you know, top guys, and they're talking about gravity. And that's it popularizes quantum gravity and sort of establishes quantum gravity, you know, of which you could say string theory is like the stepchild or whatever. And so Bainson is clearly like funding like, you know, pretty important stuff in physics. And he writes a fiction novel called The Stars Are Too High. And it is about the creation of this exotic craft by a rogue German faction that the high-ranking Nazi officials weren't even aware of. And I think some of the tech goes to the US and some of the tech goes to Russia. And here's where it just gets really weird. It's like maybe that whole thing is fiction, but if you read The Hunt for Zero Point, you know, the Nick Cook book, which is very, very fact-based and hard-headed. And he shakes out saying, I don't know if the government ever figured out, you know, zero-point energy. He talks about, you know, rumored UFO reverse engineering programs in Germany, where all the first Foo Fighters were seen in 1944 and where Townsend Brown parachutes into under William Donovan and William Stevenson, Bill Donovan, William Stevenson, who create the CIA out of the OSS. They send him to go investigate these sort of anti-gravity programs that the Germans were rumored to have had. And Nick Cook actually even has a really cool documentary on YouTube where he like goes and visits the sites where these anti-gravity projects were supposedly rumored to have taken place. There was one with a scientist named Mita and another named Shriver. And I think one was in the northern Germany and the other was in Bavaria. And I think Mita was in Bavaria, if I'm not getting this wrong. And then there's this like crazy like scavenging from both the Americans and the Russians to get this tech as fast as possible. And the nominal mission on the American side was called TICOM, and they were trying to get this Nazi Enigma machine that was, I think, even more complex than the traditional Enigma machine, and they didn't want the Russians to decipher it first. But there was a whole laundry list of like kind of weirder esoteric tech underneath that, and that's what Townsend Brown was presumably. That's why he was parachuting in. Robert Sarbacher was supposedly there as well. And Grush has talked about him being reportedly in the stand-up of, you know, UFO secrecy. So, it's a really interesting question. Like, did the Russians figure this out too? And then do we have sort of this competing program that, you know, maybe we both took it from the Germans or something. Maybe paperclip was like all the more pressing of a need for paperclip because of that history. And Hermann Oberth, who was the original kind of father of German rocketry, he was Wernher von Braun's mentor. There are tons of clips of him talking about, you know, UFOs and flying saucers in the sky and ETs. And Wernher von Braun was obviously a very trippy guy who talked about entities guiding him to space and was actually very instrumental in the creation of Stargate, which was the CIA's psychic spy program, and wanted to do parapsychology experiments in space, was like very into all of that stuff. So it's a weird history. And, you know, maybe the Bainson thing is total fiction. Maybe he's hiding reality. Maybe he's hiding truth in fiction. I don't know.
Let's get back to Agnew Bainson. In addition to being an entrepreneur, Agnew was a private pilot with an interest in astronomy. In fact, Agnew was a participant in Operation Moonwatch. So, what is Operation Moonwatch? It was a program led by the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory that encouraged amateur astronomers to track artificial satellites, a pursuit closely tied to the broader Cold War context. In other words, watch the skies. This may have fueled Agnew's and Rogers' fascination with anti-gravity and UFOs. The interest in flying saucers held by both Roger and Agnew seemed eccentric to many, including Wheeler. However, it was Roger and Agnew's willingness to support alternative avenues of research that led to fresh perspectives in gravitational physics, which we now enjoy. Because of the excoriation from Wheeler and others like Martin Gardner, Agnew had developed a protection clause, which would accompany any publicity related to his institute. This clause made it clear that any work conducted at Agnew's institute was not associated with anti-gravity and instead was based on the Newton-Einstein analysis. Despite this, Agnew-Banson privately remained steadfast in his pursuit of anti-gravity, even exploring the concept of electrogravitics and achieving lift with the help of his collaborator, T.T. Brown. It was a claim that piqued the interest of physicists. To verify these claims, Bryce DeWitt and other renowned physicists, like Edward Teller, were called upon to evaluate these devices, though they maintained a scientific stance and noted that the lift was likely due to electrostatic effects. Agnew was, after all, maintaining immense voltages across small distances. In fact, in another unexpected twist to this story, the poster child of string theory, Ed Witten, has a family involvement in this. His father, Louis Witten, was involved with Banson, stating, "I went to visit him and visited his laboratory, and the basic idea of his laboratory was he had a strong electrostatic field, which was about 150,000 volts over the distance of about a meter. And he had an operator operating this thing, but I knew enough about experiments to know that this was not a very happy place, because I know that for strong electrostatic fields, there shouldn't be any sharp points around. Everything should be curved, and nothing was curved." Louis Witten also indicated that Agnew started the Institute for Field Physics, in particular for Bryce DeWitt. Perhaps he wanted some facade to get physicists like the DeWitts to verify and even build his anti-gravity crafts. Companies like IBM, General Dynamics, and even Glenn Martin Aircraft Manufacturing Company saw potential applications of anti-gravity technologies in their business. These corporations weren't just spectators, they were actively engaged. Actually, it was Glenn Martin that, after several mergers, became what's now known as Lockheed Martin. Gravitational physics was no longer just an academic pursuit, it had real-world applications that could irrevocably alter industry. You've heard of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. This is the place that was home to some of the greatest minds in history, including Albert Einstein and Kurt Gödel. It's also the current home of Ed Witten and Nima Arkani Hamed and Juan Maldacena. Well, Glenn Martin of Lockheed Martin, inspired by Banson and Babson, aimed to create an industrial version of the Institute for Advanced Study, a place where theoretical discoveries could be applied to solve practical challenges. It was called the RIAS, that is the Research Institute for Advanced Studies, and it was established in 1955. Coming back into the fold, Ed Witten's father, Louis Witten, was not only hired, but helped connect people, organize workshops, and also arranged some of the funding for Glenn Martin's Research Institute at a time when this was extremely uncommon. In fact, Louis Witten was the only one in charge of finding research for the Institute, identifying everyone who could potentially help with Martin's Institute, and hiring them. Even Burkhard Heim was contracted by the RIAS. You may remember Heim from Gary Nolan's podcast On Toe, where Gary talked about Heim's theories.
But basically, this structure that he draws here at the end is a visual representation of how, when a certain structure is created, at the top of it, through these levels of organization, consciousness would form because of it. That then you could take away the underlying structure that formed it, and then this would continue to exist independently. If it's right, it means you could create an artificial intelligence, which was in and of itself, could become conscious. Humans might someday be able to, without using biology, but using purely materialistic approaches, build a sufficiently complex machine that creates an object with consciousness and a soul. It's fascinating.
Heim was one of the first, if not the first, to posit that all interactions, gravity, EM, weak, and strong, are unified in a higher dimensional Euclidean space, with extra so-called imaginary dimensions. This was prior even to Yang-Mills. Apparently, Hermann Weyl said that the highest chance of anti-gravity lay with Heim's theories, but unfortunately, after several attempts, I wasn't able to track down this source. If someone viewing this has the source of the text on screen, then please let me know and place it in the comments. While it wasn't said publicly, it was known through the grapevine that the Glenn Martin Company was interested in anti-gravity. Recall, you can think of the Glenn Martin Company as the predecessor to Lockheed Martin. In Witten's words, there was a new thing in the wind at the time, which was anti-gravity. It was in the wind. I quickly learned that I should talk about gravity and that they would ask me about anti-gravity. And I'd say, well, we just learned about gravity. If there's anything to anti-gravity, it'll come along. MIT professor of the history of science, David Kaiser, along with University of Sydney professor of philosophy and physics, Dean Rickles, cataloged this, and the links are in the description, as well as links to all sources. Now, if this wasn't convoluted enough, Witten explicitly commented on potential anti-gravity materials, saying a guy in France was discovering that on the night of a new moon, a pendulum swung faster or slow. A guy named Townsend discovered that there was a type of bismuth that was repelled instead of attracting.
The first astrophysics symposium not only started this field of relativistic astrophysics, but it ended a chapter which is a sort of interesting small chapter in the history of relativity. I'm referring to the worldwide craze that lasted for about 10 years in the discovery of anti-gravity. And I bring that in because that impacted on my life quite considerably. In the middle 1950s, I found myself after a different, I should say, youth than one might expect, employed by the Martin Company, now the Lockheed Martin Company, which was mentioned by the dean earlier. In the mid-1950s then, I found myself employed at the Martin Company with a rather weak PhD, I would say, at the age of about 35, with a few children. There was a vice president of ideas. That was not his title, but his function was to bring the company into new eras. The company was building airplanes and building rockets. It ultimately built the Titan rocket, which was used for many space vehicle flights. The vice president had the idea, which was to him a wonderful idea, to develop anti-gravity. Of course, when he tried the idea in public, you could imagine the greeting he received by the scientists.
So let me begin by saying that I'm not an expert the way you guys are. You've been studying this field for a long time and you know far more than I do, but I'm going to try to give you a perspective that's coming from my personal experience and a ufological experience about trying to decipher the clues around gravity control based on the evidence that I've seen and so forth. And so that's what my focus is, or what I'm trying to share with you today. And so the next slide captures sort of what my father did. This is sort of the introduction to my world. Is that, you know, I'm 13 years old, and my dad tells me that you know, hey, I'm working on anti-gravity at Douglas Aircraft Company. And he convinced his management to give him, you know, $600K back then, which is like 4.5 million today, to do, you know, interview abductees, to set up a Michelson-Morley interferometer and try to change the speed of light, to work on a whole host of physics experiments, the theoretical stuff as well as practical stuff to try to figure out how gravity works. And this all started for him when he was at a meeting with his management, and they said, "Well, Bob, what are you doing for fun nowadays?" And he said, "Well, I've read 50 UFO books, and there's only one question left." And he said, "Well, what's that?" He said, "Are we going to figure out how this works before or after Lockheed does?" And that was the start of his funding for this and his push into a deeper understanding of ufology. Um, and I, you can see him. General Schriever is up with the missiles above, and my dad on the left in 1974, and then my dad 6 months ago, well, 9 months ago or so, at 96 in Newport Beach with me. There are links that I can provide to the 157 pages of material related to Douglas Aircraft Company's gravity research and theoretical research. And it's interesting, but it's history, and there's no. I'm not sure that I have not fully mined it for insights, other than putting it in my AI ufologist. AI GPT, gravity GPT as data. Why don't you go to the next slide there? Just again, it's fun. This is 1974 for me. I'm a senior in high school, and I set up a Michelson-Morley interferometer with a little magnetic field, trying to change the speed of light and try to look at fringe shifts on a pool table in Newport Beach. But I did enter the science fair and won first prize at the Orange County Science Fair. But that's sort of my early indoctrination. I was 19 years old there. At that time, 18, 19, I think. And that was my genesis. And then I sort of ignored it other than ufology until last year and started to get more serious. Go to the next slide about ufology, or not ufology, but anti-gravity. So one of the first interesting things is this guy, Dudley Bowen Clark. Out in the desert in 1951, he had, $6 million down a dirt road with contracts with the Atomic Energy Commission and Navy and Signal Corps, working on an gravity insulator. So that was what his team was working on. And I have a large file on him, and I've requested his FBI file. But I find it very interesting that, here's the first thing that resonated with me. I mean, gravity control may have gone back to the Nazis and earlier, but for me at this time, I'm thinking that this is sort of the origin point of progress. Next slide. Did you get the next slide there, Tim? There we go. And here's the newspaper article that sort of talks about this in detail in 1951. Next slide. And then you may have seen this before, this New York Herald article where the guys at Convair and General Dynamics division were doing work in 55 on spinning magnets and spinning permanent magnets. Maybe high speed, those look like air bearings maybe, or they're working on that sort of thing. And this is your sort of first clue that spinning magnetic fields is key to an understanding of how to break through gravity potentially. Next slide. And then you may have all seen this picture of the G engines are coming in 56 in Young Men magazine, and mentions of Glenn Martin, which we'll talk about more, and the other key people, including Clark Electronics Labs at the end. But I'll mention that this guy Michael Gladwich that wrote the article was a World War II fighter ace in Poland, then France, then in the UK, and was injured, but very much plugged into the entire aerospace world in a detailed way in these 50s time frame, and participated in a lot of behind the scenes meetings. And to my surprise, he wrote a book on Admiral Byrd on Antarctica. For those that are following the mysteries of aliens in Antarctica, but I find that interesting, as sort of a plausible connection. Next slide. And here we get to the mother lode, in my opinion. This is the Glenn L. Martin starts this RIAS group. Walcom Bender was the leader at the time, but he starts it in 55, and all these super powerful, heavyweight theoretical physicists and mathematicians are working hard at trying to figure out gravity and gravity research. Lewis Witten has got videos about bismuth magnesium, and people recognize Rudolf Kalman for the electronic Kalman filters. But ... I've requested FBI files on a lot of these people, and we'll talk more about George Trimble in a little bit, a few slides later, and his involvement with Lockheed Martin's. So in the next slide, we'll also talk about, in the 1960s, NEPA was canceled, nuclear propulsion aircraft. Why did they do it? Maybe they figured out gravity, or they decided, well, there's lots of potential reasons why you wouldn't want to have a flying nuke around. But the newspaper articles on gravity stop, and there's the counterintelligence effort probably to squash them or not support them. NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, is transitioned from sort of a pure research mode, which Asloff and others will highlight, to more technology focused, where let's just make an MRI machine to do something. And then, as Hal Puthoff and others, and Tim no doubt understands, that string theory kicks off in 68 as a potential cover story for how to push the mainstream physicists down a track that's a dead end or a mildly useful end. So anyway, I'm just sort of commenting on that. And the next slide. And then you may have all heard about Ben Rich's efforts at the Lockheed Skunk Works for 15 years. But I'll pull you to the third bullet. Is that there's an error in the equations, and we figured it out, and we know how to travel to stars, and it won't take a lifetime. When I think error in equations, I think these are human beings figuring out errors. And GR is not correct, and they fix that, or Maxwell's equations are not correct, or the combination of the two, or scalar functions are not correct somehow. And so they figured it out. And I don't think the ETs are giving them equations on a they wouldn't quote figure it out. They would just be given the equation. So anyway, I find that highly suggestive that it was us that figured out how gravity works, rather than some sort of celestial gift from others. Next slide. I'll give my shameless plug for the second edition of Magic Eyes Only, which is on Amazon. It's got 104 UFO crash cases from around the world, and it's updated from my first edition, which had 74. But for those people that are interested in UFO crashes and some clues in physics, but not nearly as many as, say, Paul Hill's book, this is an interesting read. Next slide. So now I'll sort of talk about potential man-made anti-gravity crashes, or cases, excuse me. And I'll have to credit Michael Schratt for his work on finding some of these and illustrating some of these, and highlighting the fact of their man-made nature. We'll talk a little bit about the Danielson, Connecticut case, and then the Eddie Laxson case as well. So the next slide. So November 20th, 56, this woman stands outside. She's got this 25-foot cross craft with these very detailed drawings. These are drawings of these Tesla coil type tools, or propulsion systems. No sound, heat, smell, hovered, maneuvered. Um, it looks like insulators on transformers or Tesla coils and so forth. I just find it interesting that in my mind, this is another potential clue as to the nature of how gravity works as well. Next slide. Tim, you there? Next slide. Counter rotation. So that's another principle that I find interesting, is that there's several cases where you can clearly see both sides of the disk rotating in opposite directions in a counter rotation manner. And so that's the another interesting aspect or clue to the nature of gravity control, as well as this hum, this noise. And this was investigated at the very highest levels, military officers in New Zealand where it happened, as well as the US and so forth. So again, that's I think a fascinating other clue to the nature of how to do gravity control. Next slide. And now we come to the one where I'm sort of staking my position on, is this Eddie Laxson case in Temple, Oklahoma. So this is a Air Force electronics, like 15-year veteran, driving to work, rounds the bend, sees this craft parked in front of him with this huge electrostatic wick behind the back of it, and a man standing out in front. And he gets out of his car and walks towards the man, and the man notices him. He gets in and they fire it up, and this low level hum starts, and he takes off flying away very rapidly. And there was another witness to this effect too. And the next slide shows his drawing, his first-hand drawing, showing a horizontal stabilizer on the rear, and then these lights, and this little standard fold-down gangplank, and a human being. And this is this is his first-hand drawing with the letters TL4768 on the test lenticular device or something like that. Next slide. So it's interesting. This is his comment. What I saw was definitely not from space. The man was wearing fatigues, had a hat, bill broken up, Air Force mechanics, common English letters on it. So, the next slide. He was clearly impressed that this was a human being. This is the Blue Book card that had multiple witnesses, and a mention of this hum, this buzz that occurred as this craft lifted off, this and that humming whiz noise or increasing pitch has occurred in several cases. Next slide. So when I think about the problem, I think of, well, if this is working in 66, they had to have designed it in 64 or built it in 64. Maybe they figured out anti-gravity in 62 or earlier, or maybe this is one of earlier ones. So this is highly supportive of that. And you got to realize, on the left, these are the technologies you got to work with. You've got to work with analog dials, you got low altitude operations, you got high power vacuum tubes, no advanced semiconductors, you got magnetics, you got electrostatics, you got magnetism, you got barium titanate, which is a capacitor, dielectric. but you don't have some of the fancier stuff. You don't have any fiber optics or carbon fiber or GPS or squat. So you got to think in the mindset of we should be able to do gravity control using 1960 technology, and it should be possible to do it that way. Next slide. And now I'll take you to the orange juicer with tentacles in 67. So Bill is, watching television in his house, hears the dogs barking and goes outside, static electricity everywhere. His arms are all up and head, and he sees this craft with these electrostatic wick tentacles and these little gooseneck spotlights coming out of the craft. And in the distance, he sees other craft hooked onto the high tension power line, glowing red, pulling power out. He sort of freaks out and gets his wife and kids, hops in the truck, drives to the neighbor's house, and then, the neighbors and everybody watch it for a while, and then it all disappears. So again, electrostatic seems to be another key clue as to the nature of how to do gravity control, high electrostatic fields. Next slide. Another example in Venezuela where it looks like those are flame jets, but there's sort of plasma glows of this man who's in his apartment looking out, 100 feet towards this craft, and this sort of, two hemispheres with electrostatic fields or lightning going back and forth between them. And so that's very interesting. And then the craft leaves, and another one shows up or nearby, identical in the same vein. So again, another example of potential man-made craft. Next slide. Or this one I'm less sure about, but it's the flying pyramid. And it's the motorcyclist, his motorcycle gets totally demagnetized, doesn't work anymore. He gets radiation sickness. But I just find it interesting in that, one of the ways to make an asymmetric capacitor is to do it with a pyramidal shape. You could do it with other shapes or geometries as well. But I find that interesting and suggestive, maybe not as strongly as many of the other cases. Next slide. And then up in Canada in 2013, we had this barbell UFO case where it's slowly rotating around the center axis and emitting sort of electrical spark-like shower or plasma glow around it. And then, 6 minutes later, a second craft, identical one, shows up. Two identical craft just seems suspicious in my mind. But anyway, this is another potential interesting case that could be man-made. Next slide. And then you get to the hunt for 0 point. Many of your readers, and I think, Tim, you've interviewed Nick maybe before, a long time ago. And, the arch villain is this guy, George Trimble, who worked at Lockheed Martin and refused to talk about his firsthand experience inside Lockheed Martin around presumably gravity control. But the sort of summary of the book in my mind was that anti-gravity is bound up in counter-rotation, torsional magnetic fields, or torsion and magnetic fields, 0 point energy naturally, which is where the energy I think is coming from, nuclear spin, and electrostatics. There may be some more subtleties, but it's not just Nick Cook who couldn't get Trimble to talk. It was Tom Vallone as well, and maybe others. But from my perspective, I want to interview Nick Cook or Trimble's kids and grandkids and find out what they have to say. And I've filed for Trimble's FBI file as well, which will be interesting reading if it's blacked out, or doesn't exist, or what have you. So that's where I'm going with it. Next slide. And then many people may or may not know of Paul Hill's Unconventional Flying Objects book, Scientific Analysis. And he's a NASA engineer, collected all these case data around UFOs. And, these are the key attributes. No real surprises about the magnetic fields or electrostatic fields or, shapes or high G turns like or the Tic Tac videos or other videos that you saw in Skinwalker Ranch, or the high speed G turns with squishing people. We all know that's something that's not. It takes gravity manipulation or inertia control. Next slide. So something else people probably don't know about is the Encyclopedia of Flying Saucers. This is original onion skin leaked document after 39 years. It says highest classification of the document, top secret magic. And what's interesting about this, besides some handwritten notes by Vannevar Bush and others, is the next slide, which has this comment, but to all these things, rule out the possibility that saucers are man-made. And the handwritten note is that this should not get out, is the key wording in ink by some military or scientist in the mid 60s saying, in a classified document, this should not get out. So implies in my mind another secondary source that we have anti-gravity technology in that time frame. And we've done forensic testing of the ink and paper and pen marks and the top secret magic stamps and all that stuff. We can talk later about that. But next slide. And then, David Froning is mentioned in several articles about AFRL. What they want is proposals that focus on high voltage, high frequency electromagnetic field pulsations to induce mass fluctuations within electronic and ionic structure and dielectric materials. So that's where, the sort of government military sort of wider world. I don't think this is the top secret people that know what's really going on, but that's where they think the answer lies. And I find that interesting. And I think I agree with them. I think that the answer lies to gravity control in those paragraph and other things too. Next slide. So, this is the conundrum. Now what? And this is what I ask, so the only thing to do is to rediscover it and prove it in a credible, public, open way. Next slide. So that's what I'm focused on. I find this article interesting. Graham and Lawrence in 1980, they're sparring back and forth in Nature about, the predictions of different Minkowski tensors and Abraham tensors in all a credible way. And I think there's something to their debate back and forth as to being clues to the nature of what's really going on. And next slide. And then, you guys may have looked at the triode vacuum amplifier and the mysterious death around his involvement and various other people. What I took away from it, other than, here's another potential over unity device that's kind of intriguing, was the whole bifilar winding approach in potentially a device. But I think it's likely a dead end. People have tried it before and not made any progress. But I'd be curious to hear what your opinion is, Tim. And next slide. And then, Madman Markham, many of your audience may or may not have heard of Art Bell's. You can listen to this whole thing with his Jacob ladder and potential time machine and gravity manipulation. But what I took away from it is he's using high voltages, 20 kilovolt, 3 megavolt, and electromagnets and vortexes and So again, these are just sort of clues in my mind to something weird happened with this guy, and despite him going to jail and other baggage associated with his experience, but he got out. I mean, it was just for stealing transformers, but harmless crime in my mind. But anyway, the next slide. Is Boyd Bushman. He was interviewed in Nick Cook's book, but he has this north pole magnet test where you put two north poles and a north south pole and drop them off 4 stories, and the north falls at a different rate, and it's been repeated several times. And this is um, i- interesting in my mind in that it's a fundamental physics thing that's changed. There's a clue again about the nature of how to control gravity. I got his FBI is in hand, lots of anti-gravity mentions, but he also has a long interview about Area 51 and his comments that Richard Dolan did and others, which I sort of push off to the side and ignore. But nevertheless, I think the concept of this north pole falling at different rates is another interesting clue. Next slide. And then you've interviewed Poklanoff and Ningley, and Ningley's dead, but the point is that there's a lot of interesting stuff in this. Ningley's FBI file is on its way to me. We'll find out the truth whether or not she was really escorted out of the country or left or not, and a lot more details about what really went on with her. I did note that George Hathaway, did not see any effect repeating this experiment. And Tor, or Ningley's partner, also, um, continues in doing a bunch of classified work around gravity, presumably. At least that was what's going on. So I find these people interesting. You wonder why Podkleinoff is not all in on doing more direct experiments on gravity, but maybe he is, or maybe he's some other motivation. Next slide. And then Frederick Alsvan, which you've interviewed before on your podcast, which I've watched with great interest, Tim, and good job there. But I think that his original science there and equations and perspective is actually pretty interesting in this dynamic nuclear polarization. Could lead to gravity control. Again, that's another key clue in my mind. Hathaway and Dan Alsifan have collaborated on working on this with, as Hathaway said, ambiguous results. So I don't know if it's going to work or not, but people keep doing experiments, and by Jove, that's good. Next slide. Tim, you got the next slide? Well, I won't highlight the book, but the book's there for getting what's going on, and fluctuations of intense black body radiation influence the propagation of light signals, leading to measurable deviations in space-time intervals. So that's their core hypothesis. The question is how to test that in a robust way. Next slide. Hathaway's perspective on John Hutchinson. Um, I've read Hutchinson's accounts of and familiar with a lot of the spoon bending work of Jack Houck and so forth, and clearly the guy has some innate mental psychokinetic ability, sort of a technical psychokinesis. Later in life, I think he faked some stuff which lowered his credibility. But did he really fundamentally have some mechanism that he could use his mind or some other technology to manipulate materials and metals, maybe not with a gravity effect, but maybe with, I'm not sure, but I find it interesting. It's again, uh, it's a it's another anomalous data point that may be totally linked to gravity control. Um, Next slide. And then you have the bismuth magnesium part, the Roswell part, which people, I mean, Linda Moulton Howe sold a couple pieces for like $30,000, and people are working on trying to figure out this bismuth magnesium, zinc, and aluminum or iridium. Apparently, the iridium atoms are spaced every atom over, which I don't know how the hell they measured that, but um, there's a line of iridium atoms. Um, and the rumor is a frequency, it levitates. Um, but, Hathaway investigated and didn't find any shielding. Uh, and, but he didn't use terahertz frequencies, and there may be something to it. But I find it interesting that there's some opportunity there to keep investigating, and science will push along. But it's still problematic. Well, how do you make the damn stuff? And that's not, you can't just put it in your 3D printer and do it. So anyway, the jury's out. We'll know in a few more years, I think. Next slide. This is fresh and new. This was at the Dallas MUFON July 13th, 2024 Metamaterial Conference. Or actually it was the MUFON conference. They had this big reveal. They put out a big press conference about it. And apparently the witness said it came from Russia a couple times. It's super lightweight. And they used this handheld XRF, and it was calcium, iron, copper, titanium, but no graphene at all. And it was super light. They had it pictured on top of a flower. This particular picture is not the right one because I didn't have my camera going fast enough. But it was interesting to see that material. So that was fun, and I I find that interesting, but it's basically just a dielectric. I mean, you think about calcium copper titanate, which has a K factor of like 100,000, and maybe this new metamaterial has uh, an equal K factor, but it's light as a feather. So it's dramatically different than um, other potential dielectrics, which might be associated with asymmetric capacitors and propulsion systems. Um, Next slide. So I did create this, custom private anti-gravity GPT. So I've taken, along with my other fellow cohort in crime, Chris Ekman, we've taken a vast number of gravity related books and journals and periodical, and um, trained them all with a custom um, AI tool, and sort of had it work on a dedicated data set, um, and start to ask questions of it to better understand insights. Um, and we're trying to work on remote access so that maybe ultimately your team can explore what the tool has to say about a particular aspect of anti-gravity control and things like that might be useful. In my real business as the CEO of Electric Fusion Systems, we've used a similar tool that's all trained up in fusion literature, and it's been highly helpful in just exploring quick ideas and getting calculations in many cases back that are highly useful. So, um, um, next slide. This is another interesting article by a couple of Italians, quantum vacuum energy, gravity manipulation, and force generated. So I don't claim to understand it all, but I find it interesting that these people are working on it. And in that article, they highlight the next slide, which is this sort of asymmetric ZPF shape where you have a high frequency region and a lower frequency ZPF region, and it pushes the force forward. So is this a clue as to how flying triangles that are in the UFO field work, or the pyramid shapes or the ice cream cone shapes work as well? So anyway, I just find it suggestive that there's some clues there that are worthy of experimentation. Next slide. And then you've interviewed Brandenburg, I think, before. He got this 200K DARPA contract to write up his theory on gravity control, and claims to have a 7% mass reduction in his experiments. But my comment to that is, well, if you get 7%, well, where's the scale up? Where's the next level? Why haven't you made one that's a hell of a lot bigger, better, fancier, etc.? So I worry that there's something not really there. He talks about this vortex of pointing vectors as key takeaways, and I think there's something there as well. But fundamentally, it lacks mainstream validation. It hasn't been repeated. The standard model of particle physics and general relativity don't support this, what he's doing. And, but this is the usual diatribe they say to all of us who are working in the gravity field. Next slide. And then, so, I go to this, this is my set of thoughts about where the secret lies. And it lies in a lot of these different aspects. And you can read down, and we've talked about many of them before. So now the question is, in the next slide is, now what? How do we take it to the next level and move forward in the next slide? So I'm focused on interaction with magnetic fields, electromagnetics, electrostatic, high voltage capacitors, and I want to use Michelson-Morley interferometers to measure the changes in speed of light, which are relatively straightforward. And next slide, to put your test apparatus in that and see if you can get fringe shifts that are dramatic, or show. I mean, it'd be great to measure, mass changes and the damn thing got lighter or floated off the bench or on and on. But I think that realistically, you may want to start with this, or if it doesn't float off the bench, put this in place. Anyway, but you're familiar with that. Your audience is familiar with that, I think. Next slide. So here's sort of my first iteration of an approach, and I keep evolving it. Again, I'm sort of new to this, but I'm doing my best. So I started with spinning permanent magnets with motors and Helmholtz coils with bifilar windings, and then I threw in some asymmetric capacitors in the middle. It may be wrong to have two. I may only have one. Might want to put it at 90 degrees, and you can do. I added an electrostatic flap in between the Helmholtz coil and the spinning magnets to create sort of static electricity. So it's a combination of a Van de Graaff generator, Helmholtz coils, and torsional fields from the spinning magnets, and you can vary the winding voltages and currents and measure it. The test matrix on this is nasty as hell, and there's a lot of different tests that can be done to see if you get any responses. And the next slide. So here's sort of a picture of my workbench and work in progress, as doing a variety of the tests using RC motors that spin up to 15,000 RPM. And I made some, custom plastic holders. And when you start building things, it gets a lot more real. Next slide. And here's a picture of an asymmetric capacitor that I'm working on. I may make it actually the Giza pyramid, geometry. But in essence, you got to get the CCTO from China, because the U.S. doesn't sell it really unless it's outrageously expensive. And just so everybody, the K factor is up to 100,000. And you can mix in bismuth or magnesium, or bismuth most realistically, because it will sort of melt at a lower temperature, or when you press this whole thing together and sinter it, because you have to the calcium copper titanate is you sort of have to squeeze the shit out of it for like a day, 30,000-40,000 pounds, 15-20 tons. And then you put it in an oven for 10 hours at 800 C to sort of really sinter it all together. And then you hit it with a water jet and cut the shape that you want. And then you can start doing experiments with it, of, square waves and pulses, and see what you can learn about this weirdness of asymmetric capacitors. Next slide. Here's another proof of concept one where I put a ring of capacitors up to 50,000 volts in series in the middle, with some bifilar windings or not. I don't really know about that. And then the spinning permanent magnets, trying to look at a different set of test things. This might be generating electricity as well, or some sort of gravity effect. Or some physicist is going to call me afterwards and say, "You got this all wrong, Ryan. You ought to do this, this, and this." And so I'm open to that. But anyway, let's go to the next slide. And then, so sort of the final thing is, let's investigate and rediscover, but which is what Tim's been doing all along, is championing the whole reinvestigation effort and trying to get people to communicate and figure this all out. But I guess what I bring to the table that other people may not is the investigative journalism in me, where I'm going to get a lot of these FBI files, and I'm going to find and interview a lot of these people that know something. I'm going to do some remote viewing targets, because I've used those people before to try to understand what happened in the past and what could happen in the future. And then ultimately, you can find the R&D teams in corporations, their people, and you can start to do that. And ultimately, in the end, which is our goal here, is to build it and test it and prove it in a public big way, because this is the giant crime against all of humanity, is that we could have had the free energy and allow for an upgrade of water and food and energy and aviation, and environmental control, and or not control but improvement, and move the planet from where 1/3 of the people are starving to death and don't have a high school education, to something far better. And so uh, with that, I think that's the last slide, unless there's another slide after that. Oh yeah, why invest? Well, I'm walking for ideas or investment, so, but you sort of knew that. And I keep doing it on my own, because that's what has to get done. So